In this video, I'm going to introduce biological macromolecules, and we are not going to go into great detail in this video because I have another video that talks a little bit more about the different types of biological macromolecules and their structure and their functions associated with the cell. So in this video, we're just kind of introducing the concept. And related to those biological macromolecules, we're going to talk about the monomers and the polymers that are associated with those macromolecules. We're then going to talk about metabolic reactions in which those monomers get bonded together to form polymers, or the polymers get broken down into their smaller components, which are the monomers. And we're going to talk about kind of two opposing reactions. One are the anabolic reactions, which happen through a process known as dehydration synthesis. The other are catabolic or catabolism reactions, which happen through a process known as hydrolysis. So first, let's introduce this concept of a biological macromolecule. And macro just means big. So what we're talking about here are big molecules that are essentially required for life, because remember, biology is the study of life. So we have four different kind of categories of macromolecules. And for most of these macromolecules, they are also referred to as polymers. There is one exception, and that is the lipids, and we'll kind of explain why they are an exception a little bit later on. But polymer, remember the suffix poly just means many. And so these polymers are just these large molecules made up of many smaller building blocks. And that's where our monomers come in, because the suffix mono means one. And so our building blocks of these macromolecules are actually these smaller molecules that get bonded together to make the bigger molecule. So let's take a look at some examples. So the first type of macromolecule that we're going to talk about are the carbohydrates, or the sugars. And really what we're talking about here are the complex carbohydrates, which we would also call polysaccharides. And some examples of polysaccharides are going to be things like starch, glycogen, and cellulose. Now, the monomer or building block of these complex carbohydrates are going to be these smaller molecules known as monosaccharides. And examples of monosaccharides include things like glucose, fructose, and galactose. Now, the second class of molecules we're going to take a look at are going to be the proteins. And proteins are also kind of referred to as polypeptides. Although polypeptides are not necessarily proteins. So a protein has to be a polypeptide that is actually folded into a three-dimensional functional shape. So you can't technically use those terms interchangeably, but you have to have a polypeptide before you have a protein. So the polypeptide is the kind of the polymer associated with the class of proteins. And the monomer or building block of these proteins are going to be amino acids. And there are actually 20 different types of amino acids. The third type of macromolecule or polymer that we're going to talk about are the nucleic acids. And examples of nucleic acids include things like DNA, RNA, and ATP. And the monomers or building blocks of nucleic acids are smaller molecules called nucleotides. And examples of nucleotides include thymine, adenine, guanine, cytosine, and uracil. And then the last kind of class of macromolecules we're going to talk about are lipids. Now, lipids are not true polymers. And they do not have a universal monomer, but we'll talk about some of the smaller molecules that kind of make up these lipids. But some examples of these macromolecule lipids, or kind of these bigger lipids, are going to be things like triglycerides, phospholipids, and things like steroids. So as I mentioned, lipids do not have a universal monomer, so you might want to make note of that. But some of them contain glycerol and fatty acids. So now let's talk about metabolism. You've probably heard the term metabolism referring to maybe how quickly someone gains or loses weight. And that is part of what metabolism is. But by definition, metabolism is just all the chemical reactions happening in a living organism. And we can actually get a little bit more specific and talk about two different types of metabolic reactions. So one type would be known as anabolism, or you could say an anabolic reaction. And anabolism is just where smaller molecules are bonded together to form a larger molecule. Now we can draw this out kind of in shorthand to just look like this, where each one of these circles is a different smaller molecule that gets bonded together to form this larger molecule. And to relate this back to what we were talking about on the previous slide, we could call the molecules on the left side of the arrow, we could call these the monomers, or the building blocks, and then on the right side of the arrow we would have the polymer, or the macromolecule. The other metabolic reaction or type of reaction we can talk about is catabolism. And catabolism is just the opposite of anabolism. So it's taking a large molecule and breaking it down into its smaller components. And we can just draw the opposite as what we drew for anabolism. So we could just draw our polymer, or our macromolecule, being broken down into its smaller monomers. Now, one way that I remember the difference between these two types of metabolism is I look at that word cat in the word catabolism. So catabolism is to break stuff. And I think about how cats like to get up on shelves and break all of your stuff. So you can hopefully remember this by cats break stuff. And in catabolic reactions, stuff is getting broken into smaller pieces. So first, let's take a look at a type of reaction known as dehydration synthesis. And sometimes this is also known as a condensation reaction. So I can add that here, condensation reaction. And this is really the reaction involved in those anabolic reactions. So remember, anabolism is taking smaller components, bonding them together to make a larger molecule. Now, if we take a look at this word dehydration synthesis, so first of all, when you look at the word dehydration, you might be thinking of losing water. So you become dehydrated after you have been sweating a lot and you've been losing water out of your body. Now the word synthesis means to make. And in this case, we are making a bond. So if we were to draw this out in shorthand, we could draw once again our monomers bonding together to form our polymer. And then to finish off this reaction, we actually need to add a molecule of water. So now we have to ask the question, where does that water come from? So let's take a look at a more specific reaction, looking at an amino acid forming a bond with another amino acid in order to form a dipeptide and a molecule of water. Now, dipeptide means two, so it's not a polypeptide yet because we're only looking at two amino acids getting bonded together. But if we were to add a third amino acid, or a fourth, or a fifth, or just keep adding amino acids, we would eventually get to making that polypeptide. But to start out, we're going to take a look at a simple amino acid known as glycine. So we're going to take two glycine molecules and bind them together to make a dipeptide. So if we look at our glycine molecule, it looks something like this. And then we'll go ahead and draw our other one over here. All right, now the first thing we have to do is actually identify our functional groups. So if you're not familiar with functional groups, you might want to go back and watch the other video I have that talks a little bit more about those functional groups. So looking at amino acids have two functional groups, or at least glycine has two functional groups associated with it. So one of the functional groups is an amino group. You can see that on both of our glycines here. The other functional group is a carboxyl group, which we can see here. And so how these functional groups work is that one functional group, in this case carboxyl, is going to give up an oxygen bonded to a hydrogen. In the other monomer, the functional group, the amino functional group, is going to give up a hydrogen. So what happens when you have an oxygen and two hydrogens just hanging out? Well, they can form a bond with each other, which gives us H2O, which is water. So this is the dehydration part of dehydration synthesis, because we are pulling a molecule of water out of our monomers in order to free up some bonding spots. So what ends up happening is that the carbon in this carboxyl is now going to form a bond with the nitrogen in this amino group. And what we end up with is a dipeptide that looks something kind of like this. Where our new bond that formed is this one right here between the carbon and the nitrogen, and this is our dipeptide. And then this water that we formed over here is going to become one of the products over here. Now, one thing you might notice in our dipeptide is that we still have some functional groups available. So our dipeptide still has an amino group on one end and a carboxyl group on the other end. So this dipeptide is not necessarily done bonding. We could actually add another amino acid really to either side of this and still be able to do a dehydration synthesis reaction. And for every bond that is made, you would have another molecule of water. So if we go back up to our example up here, in reality, because in the example I drew up here, because we're actually forming two bonds, we would actually form two water molecules in the process, because one would come from the production of this bond and one would come from the production of this bond. The other type of chemical reaction or metabolic reaction we're going to talk about is hydrolysis. And once again, we can take a look at this word and kind of break it up into its root. And we can look at hydro and lysis. So hydro should make you think of something having to do with water, or hydrogen really, but having to do with water, think of things like hydration. Lysis means to break. And so I like to define this reaction as a chemical reaction in which a molecule of water is broken to break a bond. And you can see that we're talking here about things being broken. So if we were to kind of draw this out just as in shorthand, we could take a look at a polymer. And that polymer would be getting broken down into its monomers. And for every bond that's broken, we would actually have to have a molecule of water. So in this case, since we have two bonds that need to get broken, we have to have two molecules of water in order for this reaction to take place. So let's take a look at the reaction that we did on the previous page, because hydrolysis is really just the opposite of dehydration synthesis. In catabolism, it's just the opposite of anabolism. So we could take a molecule of water plus a dipeptide and break that dipeptide back down into its individual amino acids. So we'll first take a look at our dipeptide that we looked at, or that we created when we were talking about dehydration synthesis. And that dipeptide looked something like this. And remember that the bond that was created in the previous example was this one right here between the carbon and the nitrogen. Now, in order to break that bond, essentially what we have to do, we have to put the OH back on the carboxyl group, and we have to put the H back on the amino group in order to break this bond and then recreate these amino acids. So first we can identify our amino groups in our two original amino acids. And then we can identify the carboxyl groups from our two original amino acids. Then we can take a look at our molecule of water, and we can split it back up into its OH and its hydrogen. So we can break that bond between the OH and the hydrogen. And then the OH is going to go back on the carboxyl group of the first amino acid, and the hydrogen is going to go back on the amino group of the second amino acid. And what we end up with are the two original amino acids that we started with when we first did the dehydration synthesis reaction on the previous page. So here's the first amino acid, and now I'm drawing the second amino acid. And we can identify our fully recreated amino groups now on both of those amino acids. And remember that the hydrogen from the water replaced the hydrogen on the amino group on the one amino acid. And then we can also identify the carboxyl groups from the amino acids. And remember the OH, or the oxygen and the hydrogen from the water, is going to replace the OH on the carboxyl group in that first amino acid. So to recap, we had to break a molecule of water in order to break a bond, in order to recreate our two monomers. In summary, we talked about two different types of metabolic reactions and how they are involved in either making polymers or breaking polymers down. So let's summarize those reactions here. So remember, we talked about monomers being the building blocks of these macromolecules. So on one side of the equation, we have monomers, which are the building blocks. On the other side of the equation, we have the macromolecule, which in many cases is also a polymer, but not always, because lipids are kind of an exception to that rule. On the polymer side of the equation, we also have molecules of water. And remember that for each bond being made, we have to have a molecule of water. So in this example here, since there were two bonds being made, we would have to have two molecules of water. Now this forward reaction, I'm actually going to change the color of the arrow to green, because that forward arrow of this reaction is known as anabolism. And anabolism was accomplished through dehydration synthesis reactions. Now we could have the opposite arrow without having to redraw the whole thing. This opposite arrow is going to be our catabolic reactions, or catabolism. And remember that catabolism was accomplished through hydrolysis reactions. And to give you some additional examples of anabolic reactions, so anabolism is needed for things like growth and repair. So if you are making new cells, you have to have molecules in order to make those cells. And so your body is going to be going through these anabolic reactions in order to build those new cells. Catabolism would be something like digestion, where when you eat your food, you are eating these macromolecules. So you're eating these complex carbohydrates and proteins and lipids and nucleic acids, and your body is taking those macromolecules, breaking them down into their building blocks so that they can then be used either for energy purposes or to make new molecules. So it's interesting that the monomers that we get from the food that we eat ultimately get incorporated into the molecules that make up our body. Also remember that these monomers and building blocks and these polymers and macromolecules, these are generic terms, so we can apply these reactions to those macromolecules that we talked about at the very beginning of the video. So for example, the examples we went through, we actually looked at amino acids, which remember, if we put a lot of amino acids together, we can end up with a protein. But we could also just as easily do this reaction with monosaccharides in order to form a polysaccharide, which is just a complex carbohydrate. We could take nucleotides and do anabolic reactions to form a nucleic acid. Or we can take a nucleic acid and do catabolic reactions in order to break it down back into its nucleotides. We could also take something like glycerol and fatty acids. To make something like a triglyceride, which is an example of one of the lipids or fats.